title of this video is Writing Quality. So you've written an engineering article. You submit that to a journal. Somebody has a look at it. If they think it's okay, they send it along to some reviewers. If the reviewers think it's okay, the reviews are assessed by an editor. If everything's okay, it's accepted, goes into production, goes into publication, bingo. But it doesn't always work like that. Articles can be rejected out of hand. They can be sent back to you for revision. The editor might not like the reviews and might reject the article. It's not always a successful process. You need to be prepared to fail, but also fail as fast as you can. So why do articles get rejected without a review? Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons, but it might just be a small extension on another paper, might not be complete, it's got some kind of defects, the conclusion aren't really justified from the experiments that you did or the results that you got, may not be of interest to that many people. There's a few other bits and pieces. An important reason that it may be rejected without review is that the article contains elements that are suspected to be plagiarized. Do not plagiarize. You must cite other people. Plagiarism is theft. If you do a piece of work, if you get it through the journal publication process and you get it published, you want that piece of work recognized. You want to be recognized. You won't want other people just taking your work, stealing it, building on it, and taking credit for what you've done. With the blood, sweat and tears that you put in creating a piece of work, you're going to want the credit for it. Don't plagiarize, and you're not going to want people to plagiarize your either. It's just not the done thing. Now, impact factor isn't something I've talked about much yet, but impact factor is how many people are actually citing your work. So some journals have a higher impact factor. They're cited by many journals and others are less cited. Higher impact factors you might think are harder to get into, but this graph shows that the rejection rate is basically the same for high impact journals as for low impact journals. So don't just submit your paper to a low impact journal because you think it's not necessarily good enough. There's no reason why you can't submit it to a high impact factor journal because your chances aren't really that difficult. Obviously there's some journals that have ultra high impact factor. Obviously there are some journals that have really high rejection rates. Nature has a very high rejection rate, for example. But oftentimes you can see you have a reasonable chance in a high impact factor journal. Some journals have a much higher impact factor than others. And this doesn't necessarily mean that all of their papers are better. Nature has an impact factor of around 40, and PLOS One has a very low impact factor. And that may not seem fair, but that's just the way things have worked. And the way it works like that is because there are a few papers in Nature that have very high impact factor, and that skews the rest of the publication. Like I said, I'll be looking at impact factor in more detail, but you need to be aware that you can figure out to some extent whether a journal article is worth reading based on the impact factor of that journal. Now I'm going to get you to cite or refer to publications in your work, and I'm going to want you to do more than simply have the author, have the journal and so forth. I want you to know how many citations this particular paper has, how many people have referred to it. So you tell me what year you looked at it. In 2020 you looked at the citation count and there were 450 citations for this particular paper. You're also going to look at the impact factor of this journal. As you can see, it's Nature and it's up around 43 now. The previous slide had less than that. I also want you to cite the H index for the author. And all of these terms will become more apparent to you as we go along. but I need you to understand how they all work and why they're important. It essentially shows the reader that you're across the field. If you're citing things from nature, then you're making decisions about what not to cite. If there's an article that an author would reasonably expect you to cite from nature and you haven't cited it, well, the paper could be rejected for that reason. So you need to be really careful about which other papers you refer to. Well, you can find out what the impact factor is for journal by jumping into journal citation reports. So if you type La Trobe University JCR, it will pop up that link. You can then type in a journal name and it will tell you the latest journal impact factor. The title of this video is Reading is Hard. We've already talked about why writing is hard, but reading is hard as well. Let's see why that is. If you have no expectations at all about the order of words, the order of sentences, then it makes it difficult to know what to expect. Readers have expectations. They have expectations about the content. They have expectations about what information is new. And they have expectation about the gap between grammatical elements. Reading is hard. And if you write badly, you make it harder. And you make it less likely that your words will be read. Let's look at an example. Here's a piece of writing from a paper by Judy Swan from Princeton entitled The Science of Scientific Writing. It's got a very technical vocabulary. You need a specialised background to understand what's in here. It's got a very long first sentence, as you can see. It goes over several lines. It's got 42 words in it. Does a long sentence matter? Well, not necessarily. But how easy is it to actually read all of this text? Now you'll notice that there's a massive gap between the subject and verb pairs, and I've highlighted those pairs. So the smallest blah has been identified as blah. Recently, however, experiments blah 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 have indicated that blah encode. Okay, note the gap. There's a huge gap. The grammatical subject, the smallest at the start, is separated from its verb has been identified by 23 words, which is more than half the sentence. It's too long. So what can we do about it? Well, if we shuffle around the text, you can see now that the subject-verb gap is less than 6 words. Also, we've put the new information at the end of the sentence. That's very important. People read from left to right. They expect the old to be at the start of the sentence. They expect the new to be at the end of the sentence. But we've simplified that text considerably by reducing the subject to verb gap. And that's what I'm going to expect to be seeing in your writing. Here's another one. Again, some chemistry. Why is this particular one hard? Is it the subject verb gap? What is it? Well, yes it is. They're widely separated. The second sentence has only one stress position, but 2 or 3 pieces of information that probably are worthy of emphasis. It's a massive sentence. Sometimes things can be made simpler by making them longer. We've added flow, we've added linking sentences. I've shown those links in green. The DG and DC, bases, measuring, measurements. Sometimes longer is simpler. So how do we read an engineering paper? As I said before, you don't necessarily start writing a paper at the start. And similarly where you read, it's not worth reading from cover to cover. The first step should be a surface skim, because you're always asking the question, is it worth going deeper? You don't have to read in the same order that it's written. You only read the detail if you think it's worth it. So step 1 is read the title, the abstract, the introduction. Read the section and the subsection headings, but ignore everything else. Have a look at the conclusion. Have a look at the references. Tick off the ones that you've read mentally. Is there something interesting here? Step 2. Look carefully at the figures. Pay attention to the graphs. Is everything labelled properly? Are the results shown with error bars? Common mistakes like these will separate rushed, shoddy work from the truly excellent. To fully understand a paper, you then have to take a third pass. The key to it is to virtually re-implement the work in your mind. But process and challenge the pictures, process and challenge the words. To fully understand a paper might take you several hours, might take you 5 hours if you're a beginner. It can be worth it, but you need to take the time to read it in a slightly different way than just downloading a paper and reading the whole thing. Because if you're getting into that level of detail, you're actually wasting your time, because there's only a certain number of papers you can read, and there's more papers out there than there is time for you to read them. So if you're reading long papers, not getting anything out of them, you're wasting your time.